My family swore I was a Navy deserter. I stayed silent at my brother's Navy SEAL Award ceremony. Then his general looked at me and said, "Colonel, you're here?" The crowd froze. My dad's jaw dropped to the floor. The hallways of Naval Auditorium echoed with proud footsteps, the polished shoes of officers and recruits alike clicking in rhythm as families gathered to honor one of their own. Banners waved with the Navy's emblem, and the stage was lined with flags, medals, and solemn tradition. Yet in the farthest seat of the last row, almost hidden behind a column, sat a man whose presence defied the occasion. Jake Mitchell hadn't worn a uniform in over 2 years. The creases in his once proud posture had softened into a quiet slump. His suit, civilian and unremarkable, blended with the shadows of the room. He hadn't planned to come. Truthfully, he wasn't sure what drew him there. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was a silent ache that grew louder every time he heard his father's voice in his head, calling him a coward. 2 years earlier, Jake had vanished. No calls, no messages, no warning. One day he was serving with distinction, the next gone. His disappearance shook the Mitchell family like a thunderclap. His younger brother, Ethan, had just enlisted in the Navy SEALs, inspired by Jake's supposed heroism. Their father, Thomas Mitchell, a retired Marine who carried the American flag in his heart, took it the hardest. Desertion, he called it, a disgrace. He removed Jake's photo from the living room wall, boxed up the medals, and told neighbors he no longer had a firstborn son. Jake never defended himself. He didn't try to explain, because even if he could, he wasn't allowed to. The invitation to Ethan's commendation ceremony had arrived in an unmarked envelope, and Jake knew immediately that it wasn't a mistake. The name was handwritten, the date and time clear. No sender, no insignia, but someone wanted him there, and something inside him, something he thought had long gone cold, responded. Now he sat, invisible in a crowd that once might have stood for him, watching his uniformed guests fill the auditorium with laughter and conversation. He saw his father near the front row, straight-backed in a pressed blazer, military pins gleaming on his chest. Ethan stood beside him, tall and proud, the very image of what Jake once was. Jake smiled faintly. He didn't resent his brother. In fact, he admired him. But admiration couldn't erase the weight he carried. The shame, the silence, the lights dimmed. The ceremony began. One by one, officers and honorees were introduced. Applause rippled through the room. Ethan was called to the stage, and Thomas clapped with such force that heads turned. Jake didn't move. He barely breathed. As Ethan stood at attention, a tall, broad-shouldered man in full dress blues took the podium. General Franklin West, a legend in naval circles, known for leading critical missions across the globe. He spoke with calm authority, listing achievements, detailing acts of valor, and praising the courage of young leaders like Ethan. Then, mid-sentence, the general paused. His eyes had locked onto something, or someone at the back of the room. Jake froze as the general's gaze fixed on him. It was unmistakable. For the first time in years, someone truly saw him. Not just a man in a suit, not just a ghost from a disgraced past, but Jake Mitchell. The general leaned slightly forward, his voice quieter but unwavering. "Colonel Mitchell, you're here?" The words shattered the air like a gunshot. Every head turned. Gasps escaped. Thomas Mitchell's expression shifted from admiration to confusion, then disbelief. He looked over his shoulder slowly, until his eyes landed on Jake. "Colonel," he whispered. Jake stood instinctively, unsure what possessed him. All he knew was that his hands were trembling, and his heart beat so hard it hurt. The auditorium was silent, the kind of silence that consumes everything: sound, thought, time. Jake opened his mouth, but no words came out. The general nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's good to see you, son." Then he turned back to the podium, resuming his speech as though nothing had happened. But something had. Something irreversible. Jake remained standing for a moment before slowly sitting back down. He could feel hundreds of eyes still on him. Whispers began to flutter through the rows. He caught the look on Ethan's face, half astonishment, half confusion. He didn't know either. No one did. And that was the point. Jake had disappeared to protect a secret that didn't belong to him. Now, in one sentence, that secret had cracked, and there would be no putting it back. He sat in the shadows once more, but he was no longer invisible. Not anymore. After the ceremony ended, the usual commotion of congratulations, laughter, and photographs never truly erupted. The tension from General West's unexpected words still lingered like smoke after a fire. Families whispered instead of celebrated. Officers exchanged puzzled looks. But the one question on everyone's mind, why did the general call him Colonel, remained unanswered. Jake didn't wait for handshakes or explanations. He quietly slipped out of the auditorium side entrance, unsure what was about to unfold, but certain that he had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He didn't make it far. A sharply dressed officer intercepted him near the building's rear steps. "Colonel Mitchell, sir," the young man said respectfully, although confusion flickered in his eyes. "General West requests your presence. He's waiting in room 14. Jake nodded without a word. He followed the officer through a restricted hallway lined with photographs of military leaders and plaques commemorating heroic service. As they approached the room, the air grew heavier, not from heat, but from the weight of what Jake knew was coming. When the door opened, General West stood alone, hand behind his back, staring at a framed map on the wall. "Close the door," the general said without turning. Jake stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The silence stretched, uncomfortable but necessary. Then the general exhaled, as if preparing himself to address something that had waited too long in the dark. "I did not expect to see you today," he said finally, turning toward Jake. His tone wasn't scolding. If anything, it was almost relieved. "But I'm glad you came." Jake stood firm, shoulders squared. Even though the weight on him felt like concrete, it wasn't an easy decision. "I imagine not." West walked slowly to the center of the room, eyes never leaving Jake's face. "You understand the implications of being recognized, especially in a public setting." Jake nodded. "I was sitting in the back. I didn't think you'd notice." "I always notice." The general's expression softened, just slightly. Old habit. Too many years reading rooms and faces. "You looked older, tired." Jake didn't answer. West gestured for him to sit. "You've been through hell these past 2 years, and no one in that building has the slightest idea. I'm not here to explain myself to them," Jake said. "Only came because of my brother. And yet, in showing up, you did more than anyone expected. You let the truth start to breathe." The general lowered his voice. "They deserve to know something, Jake. Maybe not everything, but something." Jake shook his head. "It doesn't matter. The people who need to believe in me, they already stopped a long time ago." "That's not entirely true." West walked over to a side table, poured 2 glasses of water, and handed one to Jake. "Your father, Ethan, they don't have the full story, but they don't hate you. They're just lost. Hurt." Jake stared at the glass, then set it down untouched. "And what do you expect me to do? Give them a version of the truth that I'm not even allowed to confirm? You know what the oath was. You helped write it. I also know what it cost you." Jake looked away, jaw tight. "You didn't see my father when he boxed up my medals, or hear the silence on the other end of the line. When I tried calling Ethan the night before deployment, I became a disgrace to the people who once called me their hero. All for a mission I can't talk about, a name I don't get to wear, ranks I can't even claim." West's gaze hardened. "You think you're the only one who's had to live in the shadows? You're not, but few men have handled it with the discipline and integrity you did." Jake laughed bitterly. "Discipline? I vanished. I didn't even say goodbye. You followed orders. Orders that came from higher than you or me. You know what was at stake. You remember the names of the agents you pulled from Moscow, the scientist in Marrakesh, the detonator that never reached the East Coast. None of it exists on paper. But it happened, and you know it. I know it. That's all that matters now, right?" "No." The general stepped closer, voice now low and intentional. "What matters is that for the first time since your return, there's a sliver of light. You showed your face. That was enough to make people question everything they thought they knew. And maybe, just maybe, it's the beginning of reclaiming what you lost. Jake stood up. His voice was calmer now, but firmer. I didn't come here to reclaim anything. I came because I owed my brother a moment of pride. I just wanted to see him succeed. That's it. Then maybe start with him. Wes said, tell him enough to rebuild trust. You don't have to break protocol. Just let him know you never stopped being the man he believed in. Jake considered that for a long time. The burden of truth wasn't just about secrecy. It was about isolation. He had lived 2 years as a ghost, acting in the name of national security, but dying slowly as a son and brother. Could trust be rebuilt on half-truths? Could silence really be redeemed? The general placed a file folder on the table between them. No markings, no seal, just a name on the tab, Mitchell Jake. Jake looked down at it, then back up. Wes said, the next step is yours. But know this, you were never forgotten, not by the people who mattered, and certainly not by me. Jake nodded once. No thanks, no dramatic farewell. Just a long breath and the quiet resolve of a man who had lived too long in shadows, beginning to wonder if light was still an option. Jake left room 14 without the folder. Whatever details it contained weren't new to him. He had lived every operation, every loss, every win it documented. The paper wasn't the burden. The memory was. Outside, the air was cooler than it had been earlier in the day. The sun was already dipping toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the concrete of the naval base. He paused for a moment near a flagpole, watching the American flag flutter, as if it too carried secrets. That stillness lasted less than a minute. Ethan found him. He approached without hesitation, though his posture was restrained. Not angry, not cold, just uncertain. His footsteps echoed slightly as he walked across the open yard, his uniform still immaculate, still proud. Jake didn't turn to meet his gaze at first. You really are alive, Ethan said finally, his voice tight. Jake nodded. I never stopped being. We thought maybe you'd gone rogue, or you were killed, or... Ethan trailed off, struggling to find the right sentence in a storm of emotion. You left, Jake. You left without a word. Jake finally looked at him. I didn't have a choice. That's not what it felt like. Ethan snapped. You think you're the only one who suffered? You think Dad didn't go to bed every night staring at your empty room, wondering what the hell he did wrong? He buried you without a coffin, Jake. And I joined the SEALs with your shadow hanging over every step I took. Every mission, every training exercise, they looked at me and saw the ghost of a deserter's brother. Jake held that gaze without flinching. I know. No, you don't, Ethan said. Because if you did, you would have at least tried to explain. But you didn't. You disappeared. You let the world believe you were a coward. I couldn't explain, Jake said, quieter now. Everything I did, the disappearances, the silence, it was all under orders. High level, off books. The kind of operations that don't get logged into systems. The kind that don't leave room for phone calls or goodbyes. Ethan stared at him, the disbelief still evident. That general called you colonel. I heard it. What were you doing that required you to erase yourself like that? Jake hesitated. The rules were still carved into his spine, still burning against the back of his teeth. But he also knew that Ethan had earned more than silence. He had earned enough truth to feel like he wasn't chasing a ghost. I was assigned to a covert unit formed after a breach in the Defense Intelligence Agency. Jake began. We were tasked with stopping foreign assets before they became threats, neutralizing people and technology before they could be used against us. No patches, no recognition. If we died as civilians. We had different identities. No contact with family. No digital trace. Ethan blinked, trying to wrap his mind around the weight of that. And you did this for 2 years? Jake nodded. The first mission took me to South America. A rogue biochemist was selling formulas to both sides of a war. Then Europe, intercepting smuggled nuclear components. In North Africa, we extracted a double agent posing as a tech entrepreneur. Every time I finished one job, the next was already moving. I didn't sleep in the same country for more than 5 nights straight. There were no holidays, No home. But why you? Ethan asked. You were already rising fast in the Navy. You could have gone anywhere. Jake exhaled slowly. Because I've volunteered. That answer hit harder than Ethan expected. His arms dropped to his sides, the fight starting to drain from his stance. Volunteered. I wanted to serve where it mattered most. Jake said, I thought I could do more in silence than I ever did in uniform. But I didn't understand what that silence would cost me. I didn't think I'd lose you. Ethan's jaw clenched, but he didn't speak immediately. His eyes roamed the sky, the yard, the empty steps nearby. Does Dad know? Not everything, Jake replied. But General West told him enough after the ceremony. Enough to know I wasn't what he thought. There was a pause before Ethan muttered, He was proud of me today, you know. For the first time since I enlisted, I felt like I stepped out of your shadow. Jake nodded slowly. That was the point. Ethan looked at him again. Are you still part of it? That program. Jake gave a subtle shake of his head. I burned out. I stepped away after the last assignment. You can only live that way for so long before you forget who you were supposed to be. So what now? I don't know, Jake admitted. That's the first honest answer I've had in a long time. They stood together in silence for a few minutes. For the first time since the day Jake vanished, there wasn't distance between them. There was just weight, heavy truths, tangled emotions, and the ache of time lost. I don't know if Dad can forgive you, Ethan said finally. I'm not even sure I can. But I needed to hear this. I needed to know you didn't just leave. Jake gave a small nod. I didn't leave. I disappeared for them. But I never stopped watching. I read every commendation you earned. I knew about your first deployment. I watched from a distance because that's all I was allowed to do. Ethan's voice was quieter now. Then maybe it's time you stopped watching and started being here. For real. Jake didn't answer immediately. The sun dipped below the horizon completely now, and the chill in the air settled in. But he didn't feel it. For the first time in years, he felt something else. A path, however uncertain, that led away from shadows. I'll try, Jake said at last. If you'll let me. The house hadn't changed. Same two-story brick exterior. Same flagpole near the porch. Same creaky screen door that Jake used to fix every summer but never really solved. As he stood at the end of the driveway, the porch light flickered on, a motion sensor triggered by a presence it hadn't seen in 2 years. Jake hesitated. The walk from the curb to the front steps felt longer than any mission. In the silence of the street, beneath a navy blue sky, he took a breath and moved forward. Inside, his father sat in the living room, flanked by dim lamplight and an untouched glass of whiskey. The walls were lined with photographs of military ceremonies, medals, and black and white portraits of generations of Mitchells in uniform. Jake noticed immediately that his own photos, once taken down, had returned to the shelves. It wasn't much, but it was something. Thomas Mitchell didn't stand when Jake entered. His face, whether from decades of discipline and sacrifice, betrayed no immediate emotion. But his eyes, those piercing gray eyes, watched the storm just beneath their calm surface. Jake closed the door gently behind him. Hi, Dad. The silence that followed was dense. Then his father reached for the glass, took a small sip, and finally spoke. Do I address you as Jake again now? Or should I be calling you Colonel? Jake didn't answer right away. He walked forward slowly, choosing a chair across from his father instead of the couch beside him. Jake is fine. Colonel was temporary. It doesn't matter anymore. Thomas studied him for a long time, his fingers drumming against the side of the glass. I told people you were a disgrace. I told your mother, before she died, that you left us. You never wrote, never called. And every time I passed your room, it was like walking past a coffin. That's what you gave us. Jake absorbed every word, without flinching. I know, and I wish I could undo it. You should have trusted us. I wasn't allowed to. I'm your father. Jake leaned forward slightly. And you're a Marine. You of all people know what it means to follow orders. You taught me that. You trained it into me. That's different, Thomas shot back. Orders don't erase your family. Orders don't give you permission to let your mother go to her grave thinking her son ran from a fight. Jake's voice was steady but quiet. She didn't run either. She just didn't know what I was fighting. Thomas stood abruptly, pacing toward the fireplace and then back. The room felt smaller with the tension building, like the walls were inching closer. General West came to me after the ceremony, told me the bare minimum, that you were on assignment, that you couldn't contact us, that you serve in ways most men wouldn't understand. Jake watched his father closely. Do you believe him? I believe what he said. Doesn't mean I understand it. I don't expect you to, but I need you to know it wasn't abandonment. It was duty, and I never stopped being your son. Thomas turned slowly, the fire in his eyes dimming just a little. And what now? You expect us to pretend like none of it happened? That the silence wasn't loud enough to break this house in half? Jake stood. No, I don't expect anything. But I'm here now, and I want to rebuild what I can, if that's still possible. Thomas didn't reply right away. He stared at his son, his oldest boy, the one he'd raised with discipline and pride, the one he'd buried in anger. And for the first time since Jake walked back into his life, Thomas Mitchell's voice cracked. Do you know what it's like to hate your own child for something you can't prove? Jake swallowed hard. I live with it every day. The old man turned away again, but not in rejection. He needed the space, the quiet, the time to let emotions settle into words. When he finally faced Jake again, his face was tired, not from age, but from years of carrying the weight of a shattered belief. You were the reason I held this family together, he said softly. And then you were the reason it broke apart. Your brother. He held on tighter than I did. He wanted to believe you were still out there, doing something right. I didn't. I gave up. Jake took a step closer. Then let him be the example this time. The two men stood in a room filled with their own history, memories of dinners, arguments, discipline, laughter long forgotten. It wasn't forgiveness that passed between them. Not yet. But it was a start. A fracture mending, slowly, silently. Later that night, the three of them, Jake, Ethan, and Thomas, sat at the kitchen table. No one said much, but the silence now was different. It wasn't empty. It wasn't hostile. It was full of unspoken acknowledgement. Ethan asked about the missions, what Jake could share, at least. Jake offered fragments, carefully, without betraying the rules he'd sworn to follow. He didn't romanticize the danger, didn't dramatize the isolation. He spoke plainly, and both men listened, not just to the stories, but to the cost behind them. The tension didn't dissolve completely. There was still too much pain, too many missed holidays, too many birthdays where Jake's name was never spoken aloud. But for the first time in years, they sat at the same table, breathing the same air, choosing to stay instead of walk away. And when Thomas rose to refill his glass, he paused beside Jake, rested a firm hand on his shoulder, and gave it a slight squeeze. Nothing was said, but everything was heard. Weeks passed, and with them came a fragile rhythm, one Jake never imagined reclaiming. The quiet mornings in his father's house, where the coffee still brewed too strong and the news channel droned on the kitchen TV, felt foreign and familiar all at once. He had not moved back permanently, nor made any declarations about the future, but he lingered. Each morning became a small commitment to stay, to be present. Ethan visited often, sometimes in uniform, other times in civilian clothes, and the brothers talked more than they had in a decade. Still, Jake treaded lightly. The scars of absence ran deep, and redemption could not be demanded. It had to be earned. On a chilly Saturday morning, Jake stood in the garage, sorting through old boxes that had gathered dust and cobwebs. He found photographs, ones he hadn't seen since before his deployment. Ethan at 12, grinning in a too large helmet. Their mother in the garden. A family barbecue with Thomas, holding a beer and laughing at something Jake couldn't recall. These fragments of a previous life struck him harder than he expected. They were proof of something whole, something ordinary that he had left behind in the name of duty. When Ethan arrived a few hours later, Jake showed him one of the photos. They didn't say much, just a shared look, a nod, but it was enough. Rumors began to circulate at the base. Not officially, never in reports or briefings, but in murmurs. The kind of talk that slipped between trusted peers, whispered with a hint of awe and confusion. A man had been spotted at the ceremony who didn't belong to any known unit. A general had referred to him as a colonel, yet there was no record of such a commission, no files, no deployments, only vague mentions of operations that never made headlines but seemed to explain the holes in classified logs. Soldiers called him the Shadow, though no one had seen him more than once. He was a myth reborn into reality, a ghost in the shape of a man who walked freely among them and then vanished again. Jake, however, remained out of sight from official circles. He lived quietly, never confirming or denying the stories. One afternoon, while walking through town, he overheard a group of young recruits speculating about the mystery colonel who had appeared during the commendation ceremony. Jake listened from the corner of a coffee shop, hidden behind a newspaper. Their excitement, their awe, their disbelief, it reminded him of who he once was and what that image meant to others. But it also reminded him of the cost. Not all legends are built from glory. Some are forged from sacrifice no one will ever applaud. Back home, the Mitchells were adjusting. Not comfortably, not seamlessly, but gradually. Thomas still had days when he looked at Jake with the remnants of disappointment carved into his expression. There were pauses in conversations, moments when silence stretched too long. But then came the small things, a shared laugh at a comment on TV, a question about the car's engine, a second cup of coffee poured without being asked. These gestures, small as they were, carried the weight of olive branches. Reconciliation wasn't a declaration, it was persistence. The biggest shift came in December. Snow blanketed the town, softening its hard edges and slowing its rhythm. Christmas lights blinked on fences and porches, their gentle glow flickering against the quiet dark. It was the first holiday in 3 years that Jake spent under the same roof as his family. The house was decorated modestly, more out of habit than cheer, but there was a tree and a wreath and the smell of cinnamon in the air. On Christmas Eve, they gathered at the table. Thomas carved the turkey. Ethan poured drinks. Jake, still enthused in the simplicity of tradition, offered to set the table. No grand speeches were made. No apologies were rehashed. The dinner unfolded like any other, awkward at first, but warmer with every passing dish. When the plates were cleared and the fire crackled low in the living room, Thomas raised his glass. Not loudly, not theatrically, but with the same steady voice he used his whole life. "To those who serve," he began. The usual phrase, one they had heard every year, every ceremony, every memorial. But then he paused, his gaze locking on to Jake. "To those who serve," he repeated, "even when no one sees, even when they can't speak, even when their honor can't be pinned to a uniform or recorded in a file. To those who protect in silence." Ethan looked at Jake. Jake looked at his father. And in that moment, without applause, without medals, without recognition, Jake Mitchell received the only form of redemption that mattered: acknowledgement. Later, after everyone had gone to bed, Jake stood by the window, watching snow fall in the hush of the night. The street was quiet, the world asleep. He didn't feel whole. He wasn't sure he ever would. But he felt grounded, present, no longer a shadow. The war he had fought in secret was behind him. And now came the slower, harder battle of rebuilding a life piece by piece. In the darkness, he whispered a single promise to the night air. Not to the country, not to the government, but to his family. "I'm here now." No one heard him. But maybe, for the first time, that didn't matter.